Now, as Amory also said, today is our third week of our sermon series for such a time as this. And in this series, we've been looking at the story of Esther. And Esther's story is a really cool one. Maybe you've never read it before. It's a smaller book in the Old Testament that explores this woman named Esther who is called to this moment in this place of prestige and power that really she never imagined possible. And JT covered this last week. She's having a conversation with one of her family members, Mordecai, who says, all right, you were this nobody that now you become queen. You're the wrong race, the wrong religion, the wrong culture, but you found yourself in this place of power and privilege and prestige. And maybe, just maybe, you found yourself here for such a time as this. Like that's the title of this series, and it's really the quintessential part of this Esther story, that Esther is wondering, what do I do with the place I am in? Am I called to it for something special, for something unique? And for us as a church, that's the reason we chose this to pair with the data on the other end of the partner gathering, because we believe that God has called us as a church to do something special, and this might be our for such a time as this moment. And one of the things that we've been talking about in these evenings throughout the last couple weeks and we have coming up in this week is like, well, what does it look like for us to embrace that and live into that and fuel that if God really is calling us into something that is maybe different and bigger than what we currently know. And if you have your Bibles, you can go to them now to Esther chapter 5. And if you have the app, it's in there as well. It'll be on the screen. But before we get to that, I'll say this is what's kind of happening in Esther 5. And so last week, JT covered, as we dove into this, Esther is having this moment, and Mordecai, her family member, challenges her like, hey, maybe you have this position for something unique. For such a time as this, maybe that's why you're called here, to do something bigger than yourself, bigger than those around you, bigger than what you ever imagined possible for yourself. And she has this moment that I think is like equally beautiful, but also like somewhat haunting as she enters into the throne room to talk to the king. This person that is connected to her, that she has affinity to, that has connection, but it is not without risk. It wasn't like they were seen as co-equals. She was still someone that was under the authority, that was submitting to this king. And even though she was queen, there was a lot she was risking going into this moment where she was about to advocate for potentially someone outside of herself. She was looking at those disaffected and surrounding her that needed a little bit of help, needed a little bit of hope, that needed a little bit of a change, and she's putting herself at risk, and she walks in to this space and really puts everything up for grabs. And the reason I think that she's able to do this is because as she steps forward, she knows that God isn't just doing something for her, but God is doing something through her for those around her. Like she has a vision that is bigger than just herself. And she has a vision that's bigger than what she maybe ever imagined her life could possibly do up to this point. I would argue that this is what like a faith that produces a legacy looks like. Like in her mind, she sees a problem. She sees maybe her role in it, but she has this faith for what is not yet seen and what is not yet knowable, what might come down the road, hoping and faithfully believing that if she participates in a way that maybe is head-scratching to her at the moment, seems a little bit scary, seems a little bit unknown, can actually produce something bigger than she ever imagined. And I would say at the well, that's a little bit of where we are now. Like we're on the precipice of where we are and where we've been and where we're going, and asking ourselves, like, how do we continue to do what God is calling us to do? And if you were here at the 9 a.m., which none of you were because you guys are now here at the 10:45, it was like packed in here. Like it was full and uncomfortable, and we're pulling out rows and people are turning around because like chairs are getting put out and there's so much noise in here, and you know that if you like breathe the wrong way, the floor shakes, right? And so like this is a space that doesn't feel immediately comfortable. People are coming into this space, and it's because of a decision people made back in 2021 on a brewery patio to build something bigger than themselves that has got us here. And now we're in kind of a similar for such a time as this space to wonder, what do we do from here? And this is where Esther in chapter 5 find us. And I would argue and contend that legacy begins with planting seeds for those who may experience shade that we'll never experience. Like, and for many of you, like the well has served as a place of refuge and rest and shade and ultimately growth. Maybe you were spiritually hurt or traumatized, or maybe you never were, but you've come into a space that you wanted to provide that for those that were. Like this space has produced that for many of us. But where Esther was and where I think we are today is beginning to believe that we have a challenge for a time such as this to plant seeds that can grow something that isn't just for us, but is for generations that come, for people that may experience hope and healing and refuge that maybe we never imagined or dreamed would ever experience, people far beyond our imagination currently. And so that is a little bit of the context of where Esther chapter 5 is. So if you have the book opened, it'll be on the screen as well, but Esther chapter 5 verses 1 through 2 is where we're going to start, and it says this, it'll be on the screen. Oh, also, in the Well app, there's a notes section that has all the points, all the scriptures, all that. So if you're like, I already want to know where you're going, you can find that already. It's all in there. My whole outline is in there if you're interested to read that. But it says this in Esther 5, starting in verse 1. It says, on the third day, Esther put on the royal robes and stood in the inner circle of the court palace in front of the king's hall. The king was sitting in the royal throne in the hall, facing the entrance, when he saw Queen Esther standing in the court. He was pleased with her and held out to her the golden scepter that was in his hand. So Esther approached it and touched the tip of the scepter. And what's interesting about this is Esther has an action here. Like, again, I say this many weeks, like I read scripture and I go through and I'm prepping for sermons, but oftentimes we can like read it and we hear words and we're like, that's just a throwaway and that doesn't really matter. Like Esther approaching and like touching the scepter and coming in was an act of like reverence and maybe submission and coming in and showing her place and showing respect to the person that could make the decision, but also showing that she had boldness to step into this place, and she's coming into the throne room and she's creating this space for her, and she's making a choice that is not based in self-preservation, but self-giving. She is making a space that's really making herself vulnerable for the sake of those that she may not ever meet or that she hasn't currently met. So it says on the third day, she walks in, and I think this is quite interesting. Like oftentimes, either we can reverse engineer this or maybe we could argue that scripture is pushing to this, but third day language is like resurrection language if you're looking at the story of Jesus, right? Like Jesus walks in and he's crucified and he gets buried, and on the third day he rises again. And Easter is that story of the ultimate resurrection. Well, Esther, back in the Old Testament, is walking in, and it's 3 days, and she walks in, and it's their time to resurrect a story that looks like it's kind of hopeless and like there's nothing positive or good or holy that can happen. And she walks in with a faith that believed that with the power of God, nothing was impossible. And I love that because maybe you don't remember this, but Esther is the only book in the Bible that doesn't explicitly mention God or God's presence. It's not like throwing out and God said unto them this, or God did this, or back in the wings, God was orchestrating this to happen. Like God is not mentioned anywhere in this, but the faith that Esther has in a God that shows up without having to be explicitly named, fingerprints are all over this book. And Esther in this moment has a belief that God has the power to do something and that nothing is impossible, and that her response to allow this to happen is putting one step faithfully in front of the other and walking where maybe she doesn't have the light to see yet, but believing that the path in front of her will be lit as she's walking. And she's asking a question, like she's not asking about her survival, she's not asking about her own flourishing, but she's asking a question that I really think would be wild if each and every one of us asked as well, which was this, like, who else can begin to flourish because I chose to be faithful today? Like sometimes in our world, like I think about like how can I just flourish more, like how can, and certainly like I care about my own flourishing. I'm not trying to put myself in a space of demise and scarcity, and I'm not trying to necessarily do that, but Esther makes a pretty bold choice to think primarily about the outsider, primarily about the outcasts and the marginalized and the people in her culture and society that weren't flourishing when she was. And she said, what would it look like for me to make a faithful step that doesn't just allow me in my position of privilege to flourish, but those around me to flourish? And I would contend and argue that we're somewhat in like the same place as a church. Like we've experienced an ability to find shade or rest or refuge or whatever to flourish in this space. And whether that's just coming on Sunday or being in a well group or serving or whatever that looks like, many of us found this space and came to this space because we were looking for something that we didn't know existed, something that we didn't see offered in other places. And we've been able to find community and hope and connection and the ability to flourish in this space. But there are still people outside of our walls that don't know that there's a God that loves them, that don't feel seen, don't feel known, don't feel heard, and ultimately, above all, like don't feel like they have a seat at the table. And I say that knowing that many of you at one point felt like that, like you came into this space, and I've heard many of you say more or less this, like, well, I'm just waiting for like the other shoe to drop. I've had people like come up to me and confess things to me that like to me don't seem like that big of deals, and then I'm like, oh, like you still have your seat at the table, right? You still have something, but like the culture and the vibe around us often says that we're always at risk of losing the ability to belong. And we've created a space that says there's nothing you can do because it's not our job to arbitrate who gets to belong and not, but to just create spaces for the God that says we all already belong. And I would say that if I was summing that up in something more succinct, I would say that we're building a movement here that is not just for us, but we're also building a movement for them. And what I would say is, like, many of us, when we were on the outside, we felt like it wasn't us and them. Like, we came in and we're like, well, there's them, and I'm over here as us, and I don't think I'll ever get to be a part of them. Or maybe we were on the inside and we initially worried about who the outsiders, the them, was. And one of the things that I found beautifully profound about this space is, like, you guys keep erasing the lines of who the world says us and them is. That's looked like gender, and that's looked like sexuality, and that's looked like ethnicity, and that's looked like political party, and that's looked even sometimes like religious beliefs. Like, surprisingly, you may not know this, like, we have a pretty eclectic religious group that still call the Well their home. Like, it's not just a bunch of people that grew up in the same religious tradition, but we have wanderers and skeptics and people of different faith traditions that have found something profound in this space, in the story of Jesus. And I would say, like, what we're trying to do here is build something that eradicates and erases the lines that say there even is an us and a them, but trying to expand what the world knows what us actually looks like. And that's what we've been talking about in these For Such a Time as This nights that have been happening. And we have a couple of them coming up this week. I would love, if you're not at one, to see you at one. But that's what we've been talking about here. And countless times, time and time again, I've heard many of you say, this is your story. We just had one the other night, and I was going around, I was sharing, like, well, what brought you to the Well, and how'd you get there? And back, for those that came in the brewery days, which many of you don't remember those anymore, but the joke is, like, they came because if church sucked, they could get pizza and beer. Like, that was the joke. But then they realized that, like, there was an opportunity to meet other people that were hungry for the same sort of spiritual things they were. A place where they were actually surrounded by an eclectic community that looked different than them. Were able to worship and not have to check their brain or their sexuality or their questions or their curiosity at the door. Like, a place where they could actually come in and be the person that God fully encouraged them to be, with a full seat at the table and not wondering when the other shoe was going to drop, when their seat was going to get pulled out from them. And that's one of the things that we're trying to do here, is to create something. I think that's the time that God has called us to. And it was very similar to the time that Esther was called to, of trying to erase the lines of said who is in and who is out, who is protected and unprotected, who is vulnerable and who isn't. Like, Esther is trying to say, and I would argue we're trying to say, like, how do we make sure no one ever has to ask that question again? Like, how do we create a space where everyone knows they belong, point blank? How do we do that? And so Esther, as the story continues in verses 3 through 5, she walks in, and it'll be on the screen, but she walks in and she goes to the king and she asks and says, hey, I'm going to have this question. And the king says to her, what do you need? Like, anything up to the whole kingdom, half the kingdom. It's going to be yours. Just let me know. Like, if you ask it, you will receive it. And then Esther replies, well, let's have like a banquet. Let's have a dinner. Let's get you and let's get Haman. Let's come together, and there I'll ask you my request. And so she says, I'm going to bring you guys together, and I'm going to put you in this space and this. And what I noticed as I read this is that Esther, before ever making her request, the king sees her courage, which I thought was really interesting. The king says this to her in the passage, like, he notices her boldness and her courage. Like, he acknowledges, which is kind of courageous in its own right, for him to, like, create space for someone like her to have a voice and to have a thought and to entertain what that looks like. But he acknowledges it and he moves with it. And I would say what Esther experiences in this moment, because she has no resources, she has no real plan, she has no real path forward. She just has like a hope and a dream. And in this moment, I think she realized that faith often moves things before resources show up. Like, she is hopeful that if she presents what God has like strongly put on her heart, that God will walk with her forward. And I bet you that it won't always look like the plan that she had. We don't get to see exactly into Esther's mind in this, but I suspect, because this happens in all of our lives, like, the plan evolves and shifts, and there's time where she's hopefully and excitedly surprised, and other times where she's maybe frustratedly let down because it doesn't go exactly how she wants and hopes for it to go. But she dreams and has faith either way that God will provide something, that the resources aren't quite there yet. And I would say that's, again, in many ways been the story of the Well, like starting in the brewery, sitting around and having conversations around tables and dreaming about a church of what could be but didn't quite exist. And then when we lost our space due to a difference of opinion, believing that even though we didn't have a building, that God would eventually provide one. And so we said, rather than stopping to meet, we're like, well, what are we going to do? We're going to meet online, and we're going to meet in people's homes. And we did that for over a month. And then we found a home, and we were so excited about it. And then we went and found a home. And then the Friday before the Sunday we were going to meet there, we found out that they decided they didn't want to sign that lease anymore. And we believed that God would find a space for us. And then within 72 hours, we found this space, which was pretty wild. But even here, like, I think we find connection, we find community, we find belonging, but we're still dreaming of what a home for us to truly be us would look like. I think no one will look around this space and say that it's everything they hoped it would be, but they would also say it's everything we currently need it to be, right? It's a space for us to be the church that God has called us to be, and it's been wonderful, and God has continued to provide resources, not always the way we expected, and not always the way we hope, but God has continued to provide for us, and we've continued to grow. I said each service continues to grow and to see faces that aren't just returners, that aren't just new people. We just had someone at the last service that came, and this is like the funniest way that I've ever heard of someone coming to church. JT and I do CrossFit together, and our team name was The Church because I'm not that creative. And so I just said our team name was The Well. And this competition was over a year ago. And they were like, well, I saw The Well. And I was like, well, maybe I'll come check out the church. And a year later, they came to church and to check it out, all because they lost to JT and I in a CrossFit competition. But it was fun to see. It's like, and there's an opportunity for us to like be able to invite people into something in ways that certainly we never expected to happen. And a story, though, that continually, time and time again, I'm watching people in our community say, man, I've always hoped for something like this and just never knew it existed, right? The ability to have a growing and thriving kids ministry is one of the best things that I've seen. Like, parents often say, like, my favorite thing about this church, they can drop my kids off in kids ministry and I don't have to rewrite and reteach the things that you tell them back there, right? We love that. But we also know that our space is like down a pretty creepy hallway, and like that's not the best thing I've ever seen, right? And so we want to be able to have a church that matches the vision and the hope of what we have and what we're hoping to do, and to be able to continue to create a space for those to continue to come. And we will call this like a visionary, hopeful faith. And that's what I think Esther has. Like, she's hoping about what she can't see and what isn't here, but trusting that God will lead that. And that's somewhat of where we are in this space. And what we're doing is similar to what I think Esther was doing. We're trying to build a home for those who were told they would never have one and told where they didn't deserve one. And I think that's many of our stories. Like, we come into a space and we're like, well, I didn't know that I ever had a seat, but also maybe someone told me I didn't deserve a seat. And that's like the story I hear time and time again is there have been people that have come and they've sat in the parking lot. And they didn't come in because they weren't excited about church, but they were nervous. Was it going to be like every other place that told me I didn't belong? Was it going to be like every other place that I was judged for what I looked like or how I loved or how I lived when I walked into space? And a myriad of other reasons. We want to be a church that is building a home for those that were told they never had one, and more importantly, for those that were told they never deserved one. And many of us have found that. And those of us that have never had to experience that have done an amazing job making sure that that has been at the core of the ethos of who we are and what we're always about. But the story of Esther does continue. So it goes Esther 5, verses 5 through 8. She brings Haman and the king together. And so the king and Haman come into this banquet that she's prepared, and they're drinking wine, and Esther asks them, or the king asks Esther, like, all right, what's your petition? Like, what do you have for me? That says the same thing again, like, just ask, and even if half the kingdom, I'm going to give it to you. It would be granted. And she says that her petition and what her request is, that if the king regards her with favor and it pleases the king to grant the petition and fulfill the request, and the request is to bring hope and uplifting and community and thriving and abundance to those in their community around that didn't have it. Like, she's trying to raise up this community around her to experience a life that isn't just helping the people at the top thrive, but helping the people that were never told they would have a space of thriving come together, to be able to actually find, experience hope and all of that. And what I love in this is, like, Esther doesn't come forward with her position and like confront with anger or even like bold vision. She does what I think is like the most subversive but also Christ-like thing she could do. Is she like, let's have a banquet together. Let's like share a table. Let's sit across it and talk about this. And someone in our church has been a high-level executive on many boards before, and the way they describe their experience on boards, saying, like, my job on these boards is to occupy a seat at the table for those that were never told they had a seat at the table. So his job, he felt like, was to be the mouthpiece for those that couldn't actually be there. They weren't privileged enough to be there. And this is what Esther and Haman and the king are doing. Like, they are, whether they like it or not, vocal mouthpieces for those that don't have a seat at the table. They're there speaking for people. And this is exactly what Jesus does. Like, we see this throughout the entire Bible in the Old Testament and the New Testament through the Gospels. Like, think about the Last Supper, the weirdest table ever set, right? This is a table that Jesus is centered at, but it's with people that are doubters, like Thomas, that when Jesus dies and resurrects, like, I don't really know how much I really believed in all of this. He had a seat at the table. There's people like Peter that fail time and time again. Like Peter was not short on passion and courage, but he was like the biggest failure in all of Scripture. Like he fails time and time again, and not just in action, but in belief. Like he lets Jesus down in huge times of need. He's the one that denies him, right? And Judas gets all the heat for betraying Jesus. Well, Peter denied him in his greatest time of need, a great level of betrayal as well, but he still gets a seat at the table. And then Judas as well, the person that ultimately hands him over to the Roman government, betrays him, the ultimate sign of a traitor in the gospel story. And Jesus, knowing what's going to happen, doesn't take away his seat. He doesn't temper his seat. He doesn't give him like a seat over at the kiddie table. Like he gives him a seat at the same sort of table. And this is exactly what we see Esther trying to do. And I think it's what we see the well hoping and striving to do. That there's people that don't have a seat at the table, that were told they would never have one, told they would never belong, told they would never get one, but we want to continue to create seats, not just for those that have always known they had a seat, not just always knew that they were going to come in and experience it, but were specifically told that they didn't have one. And if you've gone to any of these for such time as this nights, you've heard me say this already, but it's maybe what undergirds a lot of this, right? Because when we have conversations like this, and oftentimes like big vision conversations about who we think God is calling us to be, like sometimes they come across with like hubris, like we're trying to be the only thing or the best thing ever out there. We're trying to reinvent the wheel. We are not trying to be the only church. We are trying to be the missing church. We're trying to be the church that we think God is calling us to be. And we think there is a hole, maybe a well-sized hole, for a church like ours in the community to do something that God has set us uniquely to do for such a time as this, that it has built us over the course of 4 years to do something really unique on this kind of liminal space between what we know and where we're going, and setting us apart for something different. And I go over this as well in some of these nights. Like the data right now tells us that like people are not interested in church. It's kind of doom and gloom. If you look at the numbers for a second, like 43% of Gen Z has never attended a church. 70% of them though say that they're maybe kind of spiritual still. But we're in an area that is known for highly Catholic people. Like everyone is like kind of Catholic here. I'm originally from Portland, Oregon. So like going into ministry, I became a pastor there. I got really used to being like, hey, do you guys know who Jesus is? And like, I've never heard anything about him, like genuinely. And so I would like tell them stories about that. Here I was like, hey, do you know about Jesus? And like, dude, I went to 9 baptisms this week at my Catholic church. Like there is a level of like Catholic adjacence and religious adjacence in our community. And so the duns, like people that maybe like walked away from church, was the number one demographic here outside of religious people. Now we're seeing the primary demographic is people that have never experienced church, because the duns are having more kids and raising up a generation that's less interested in church. And so 43% of Gen Z has never attended church, but 70% says they're still spiritual, like still interested in something. 1 in 5 people in St. Louis don't attend church. 30% of adults identify as religiously unaffiliated. And then 70% of people, this is the most interesting stat to me because it includes all of you here, but also those outside of our walls. 70% of people in almost every metro area identify as disinterested in religion completely, or like disinterested in what church is offering. And that means people that show up at church on Sunday feel that way, and a lot of people that don't feel that way. And what does that tell us? It doesn't mean that we need to create cooler churches with cooler coffee bars, right? That's not what it's telling us. It tells us that the story we're telling is not that compelling of a story. It tells us that the message that we're sharing is not a story that actually reflects the compelling message of Jesus, right? Like Jesus' story was so compelling that it shifted the landscape of first century existence after his life, his death, and his resurrection. And we have an opportunity like Jesus and like Esther, who changed the landscape for her community as she stepped into her for such a time moment that changed the landscape around her. And I would argue that we have that. And I would ask us, like, will we rise for such a time as this to give the next generation a church they can belong in, but also be proud of? I think both of those things are important. Like, I want them to have a church, not just us, but the people that we may never meet, our kids' kids, to have a church they can belong in, but also a church they can be proud of. Like, and I think about that, like, keeps me awake at night, right? Like, we've done a lot of these for such a time as this nights, and people say, like, I love our church, but I don't always want to invite someone to it because, like, the space maybe is uncomfortable, or I know some of us are wondering, like, well, if I bring them into this space, will like they be challenged belief-wise? Like, but I want it to be a church where people can be proud of, and that comes with everything that we are a part of, and everything that we present, and everything that we go into that. And Esther And this same passage is kind of planting seeds for a faith that will grow something that will change the landscape around her, and a soil that will actually provide something fertile for those that never knew they had the opportunity for it. And legacy that she is planting and that she is building is going to be far bigger than she ever imagined. And for us, we're in this kind of similar place where like the headlines, Esther's headlines were like, there's no hope. Things are going the wrong direction, like give up now, turn around, and just care for yourself. I would say the headlines are not dissimilar for us in our culture as well. Like we're seeing the headlines say the church is dying, that inclusivity can't grow, that you're not real Christians anyway. If you are a church for all people in Jesus is fine, but the church can't be trusted. Like those and so many things are common headlines and refrains. And we're not just trying to write a new narrative, we're trying to embrace the narrative that Jesus wrote, right? A narrative that says not some, but all are welcome. The kind of narrative that Esther embraced, that Jesus' disciples embraced, the apostles in the building, the church embraced. And for us, like I think our calling isn't just to like keep doing business as usual. Our calling isn't just to worry about keeping the lights on or wait another word that is like something just for ourselves. But I think it's to light the path forward to what the church could and should and can be. And not just our church, but the church. One of my favorite things is we had a guy named Aaron Carter come. He's starting a new church in kind of the St. Anne area, and he came here and he preached and he shared a vision of his church. And it was like the most excited I've seen our congregation as they dreamed about a church that wasn't their own, and the work that they were doing that was really like that is the hope. And I know some of you are actually helping him like walk his neighborhood and go and like share about his church to help this church get off the ground. And I would say when one of us grows, we all grow, and one of us thrives, we all thrive. And changing the landscape of religion is not the work we're trying to do. Again, we're not trying to be the only church. I think we're trying to be the unique church that God has called us to be, which is not just investing in us, but investing in other people that are doing similar sorts of work for the kingdom and to rewrite the story that is being told. And I think that's my hope for us. Like we stand in this space, and Esther stood here as well. Like during the course of this study of the book of Esther, and I hope you maybe even reading it on your own, like it becomes apparent time and time again that she keeps rubbing up with fear of preservation and fear of comfort and fear of what she might sacrifice, which are things that are safe to her, and the calling of thinking about the people that don't have the privilege of embracing those things yet, but equally are deserving of them. To think about a people that never knew they had a seat at the table, but have continually wondered if they're going to be marginalized and outcast and kicked out, but creating something that says like you are actually thought of and cared for, and above all you belong. Even if those around you don't say you do, like you belong. And so over the course of this series, and next week we're going to get into the final week of this series and continue to talk about what this looks like and tactically what we think this will look like for us as a church. And my hope and my prayer is that we can be a church that can, with a whole heart of courage and faith, step forward into where God is leading us, maybe not fully seeing what's ahead of us and the path ahead, but believing that as we faithfully take the step in front of us, the next faithful one, that God will continue to walk the path with us. And it may not always look clear, and it may not always look safe, but I think it will always look like the path that God has for us. So with that in mind, would you pray with me? God, I do thank you that you're a God that has never stopped creating spaces for all of us. And I think the narrative of religion for too long has been that it's only for some, that only some of us belong, or only some of us can have a seat, or only some of us are good enough to engage. But God, your story has always said that whether we are the faithful disciple or the doubter, whether we're the faithful disciple or the betrayer, that you've created a seat for us just the same. And so God, help us embrace our own seat and help us believe that those around us have one as well. God, be with us as we continue to worship. For our hearts for communion, let us, during this next song, reflect